Here we are at Windmill Lake with John Clark to talk about the months in the end of just before the end of the Second World War.
Well, Charlie, I was relieved or went off of active duty in the middle of July 1945. This was a few days before even the test of the atomic explosion at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The reason for that was when I returned from overseas, I had accumulated what they called points towards discharge, and a tour of combat duty in Europe, 32 missions, plus all the associated decorations and time of service, gave me, I don't know, 100 more points than was the minimum required to be released from active duty and return to civilian life.
And this was, did you say, July 1945?
Yes, in July 1945. And so I approached the commanding officer, or his office, although I did actually end up speaking with him, about being released from active duty. But not after considerable thinking about it. I even talked to the chaplain at the base, because after 3 years of service, you're sort of used to the military. But the chaplain advised me that you have enough points to get out, be released to return in life, and if you do not desire, passionately in a sense, for a military career, then a return to civilian life seems about the most logical thing. Beyond that, I wasn't particularly impressed with the military because I preferred a more life of freedom to do what I preferred to do rather than take a lot of orders from somebody else.
Yeah. Did you have any professional aspirations at that point? Or
Well,
personal ones? Did you wish to get married or something like that?
Oh, yes. I had, Maria and I had, when I returned from overseas, I spent a week in Des Moines, West Des Moines, and we talked about marriage.
Des Moines, Iowa.
Des Moines, Iowa, and I proposed it before I left for the West Coast. She said she appreciated and honored that request. I wanted to talk it over with her father because there's a lot of details. And so I said, well, take as much time as you need, but also try to arrive at a decision as soon as you can. And so I went to the West Coast, Santa Ana, and then reassigned to duty at San Angelo, Texas.
Okay, now, so it was at San Angelo where you were in July 1945?
Yes, I arrived in San Angelo probably around the middle of June of 45. That was sort of a holding base for former Air Force pilots. And I was mixed up with officers of very high rank, colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors.
You were a first lieutenant, were you, Uncle John?
I was a first Louis, which is about the lowest you can go. Second Louis is lower than that. But
you were a co-pilot or a what was your station
well, that
aboard?
wasn't terribly important, but I flew co-pilot in Europe and had a lot of four-engine time. Combat co-pilots fly half the missions, really, because of the effort. That's another matter, but the effort of formation flying.
Okay, well, sorry for the distraction.
Yeah.
So, back to San Angelo.
Anyway, I realized that there were, I suppose, hundreds of officers there at San Angelo who had experiences that were vastly more significant than anything I did. I was in a pool of hundreds, thousands, who just did their job and finished their missions. So it wasn't too hard for me to say, yeah, I think it's time to get out. But with all the points I had, the colonel commanding at San Angelo said, oh, yes, we'll release you immediately. Just give us the date you want to go. And in the meantime, Marie had decided that it would be a good idea to be married.
Sweet.
So we scheduled the marriage for July 8, 1945. And on July the 3rd, 1945, I left San Angelo, Texas, for West Des Moines, Iowa.
So you were discharged, and
Not
then
yet.
there. Oh,
Not yet. No. I was married. I got there about a day before the wedding. Went down to pick out the engagement ring, driving my potential father-in-law's car. Had an accident on the way home, a minor one, but an accident anyway. And then
did you smash it up?
No, we just someone hit the right front wheel at an intersection.
You didn't smash it up?
No, minor accident, but I probably missed a stop sign, is what it really was. So we were married on July 8th. I was still fully in the service. But on July 9th, my birthday, by the way, we headed for Fort Sheridan, Illinois, to the very base I had started in 1943 when I joined the Air Force as an aviation cadet. And there we separated from service, and I became formally a first lieutenant in the United States Army Air Force
Reserve. Yeah.
Officers were not discharged; they were released from active duty.
So your service in the reserve was a requirement
it was
of the
just
release.
the way they managed it.
I see.
I never attended a single reserve meeting, but after we were married in September, after we were married in July, in September we went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I enrolled as a student in engineering at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
On the GI Bill.
Oh yes, without the GI Bill, I never would have been able to go anywhere. But the situation, I enrolled in engineering and had a very good record. After 1 year, though...
Now, was this your first time in university then? You enlisted in the Air Force, the Army. When did you enlist in the Army?
Well, I enlisted in August of 1942.
And had you been in university prior to that?
I had graduated from high school a year previously and attended Lawrence Institute of Technology.
In Appleton, Wisconsin?
In Highland Park, Michigan.
Oh, sorry.
I learned later that the superintendent of schools in my hometown of Royal Oak was going to award me a scholarship at the University of Michigan because out of 350 I was about fifth highest in the class. But he knew my parents had no way of affording the living, and so he just did not award me that scholarship.
Your father was a worker in the Ford River Rouge plant, I believe.
Hourly worker in the hardening room at Ford's, steel hardening. But my sister was in school at another college in Ypsilanti, and that's all they could possibly afford.
Eastern Michigan University.
Eastern was called Michigan Normal College.
Oh, a normal school for training of school teachers in Eastern Michigan.
At that time, it later became inflated to a university. So anyway, the GI Bill covered my entrance to the University of Michigan, although I'll admit I was very nervous about being accepted there. But with my high school record, the problems were essentially zero. And they did not accept transfer credits, particularly from Lawrence Tech, because it was a relatively small school.
Okay, so you were admitted basically on a de novo application that you submitted to the University of Michigan.
Well, I don't know what that means.
Well, it means that you didn't. Did you have to demonstrate other academic credentials beyond being in high school at the Lawrence Institute?
No, but I had to make up courses. Mostly in the English department, because I was interviewed by a professor of engineering English, I think. But they were courses that involved writing and speaking, and in terms of an engineering curriculum, not terribly demanding.
Du sprichst English sehr gut.
Yes, I wrote diaries in my missions, and they were published recently just exactly as I wrote them. So whatever capability I had in expression in the English language can be seen by just reading those diaries. They were written before I even went on to the University of Michigan, a year before. Well, anyway.
So could you just fill us in, since we're trying to focus on the end of the Second World War, about the time between July and September of 1945 as you saw it?
Yeah, what I did, went to Royal Oak, Michigan, my home, and with my new bride, and then contacted my previous employer, a farmer engineering design company that designed special machines for production, which, although I didn't press this at all, was under an obligation to return me to my original job.
Oh.
That was part of the rules. But Mr. Farmer was glad enough to have me back because I had performed quite well with him when I was before the war, before I went into the war in '43. But we soon moved to Ann Arbor, and I enrolled at the University of Michigan.
And this was what month?
September of 1945.
Okay, is it possible for you to think back a little bit further to late July and early August of 1945, around the time of the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
We had a delayed honeymoon because we were married on July 8, my birthday July 9, and we headed for separation from the service the next day in Chicago area, Fort Sheridan. So we delayed our honeymoon until the first week in August of '45.
Yes.
A very critical week in American history.
Now, maybe you told me the other night about an incident on August 5th.
Yes.
Of 1945.
Yes.
Would you like to say something about that again,
well, yes,
briefly?
That was part of what I was going to say. My father-in-law, I think, testing his new son-in-law, asked me if I would be willing to deliver 6 acres of hay in their field of hay. That required driving a tractor with a side deliverer on it.
You were outstanding in your field at that time, is that correct?
Well, I was just freshly released from the military and freshly married, and my father had a large dairy farm in West Des Moines and was trying to get acquainted with me. So he offered me the opportunity to side deliver 6 acres of hay. That is to drive a tractor with an attachment behind it that pushed the hay which had been mowed into rows in the field. Well, I did that on the 5th of August and returned to the barnyard that afternoon and was confronted by a young farm worker who said, he knew I was in the Air Force, he said, "What do you know about that big bomb they just dropped?" It may have been the 6th of August.
Yes, 6th of August, I think was correct.
I said, well, I never heard anything about it at all. He said, we dropped bombs in Europe. I just finished a long tour of bombing German cities. And so that's the first I ever heard of it. But then, the next day, in the Des Moines Register, the principal newspaper in that area, had headlines at least 6 inches tall in black that said, "Atomic Bomb Japan," something like that. It's the first I ever heard of it. And then we, of course, became very interested in what happened and began to sort of gradually pick up information as to what occurred as a result of a very secret project in the United States called the Manhattan Project, dealing with atomic energy. After that, we went on our delayed honeymoon in central Iowa, and then returned to Ann Arbor, Michigan, or actually to Royal Oak, Michigan, my home, and I worked a few weeks with the company I was working with while I was going part-time at Lawrence Tech before the war.
Now, just if we could go back briefly to August 6th again. You mentioned the other night there was a death of a heroic American fighter
yes.
pilot
Yes.
that occurred. Well, why don't you tell us your story on that?
Well, in the Pacific Theater, there was a P-38. That's a twin-engine fighter plane flown by a very outstanding American pilot named Richard Bong, B-O-N-G.
Yes.
Who turned out to come from northern Wisconsin.
From Superior, Wisconsin, is that correct?
No, it came from Poplar, just east of Superior, about 20
Poplar.
miles. Poplar, Wisconsin.
Just east of Superior.
He was a major, Air Force major, with 40 legitimate fighter kills of Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. Congressional Medal of Honor winner, returned to the United States in 1944, I think, to test fly the new American jet fighters. But on the day that the atomic bomb was dropped in Japan, he took off from an airport in Los Angeles, military airport, and the engine failed and he crashed on takeoff and was killed.
Now, this was in a newly developed American jet fighter?
It was the Lockheed P-80, they called it. We call them F-80s now, but
yes.
It was the original jet fighter that the U.S. Air Force had developed.
So, do you think this was among the first test flights of an American design and built jet fighter?
They're constantly testing jet fighters anyway. Research testing would have been done at Edwards Air Force Base in the deserts of California.
Yes.
But this was probably to check a particular aircraft. Maybe something had been reported wrong with it, and as a test pilot, he took it up to see what was in fact wrong. And there was something wrong, and he took off, and the engine failed, and he crashed and was killed. That happened almost the same moment the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. So when we opened that newspaper in Des Moines the next day, the Des Moines Register, with a huge headline about the atomic bomb, down in the left-hand corner was a tiny news item that Major Richard Bong had been killed in an air crash. He was one of the most outstanding fighter ace in the Pacific. But that atomic bomb almost completely buried the news of the death of Richard Bong.
Okay.
And so American citizens, most people I know and ask these days if they've ever heard of Richard Bong, say no, they didn't ever hear about him. But they knew all about Eddie Rickenbacker. And they knew about certain other World War II aces in Europe. So Richard Bong became kind of an unintended victim of history. Not that it reduces his achievements in any way, but it's just an interesting coincidence of events.
Yeah. And as I understand, there's a museum exhibit about him in Superior, Wisconsin, city of Superior, Wisconsin.
Yes, we discovered 20 years later, driving across northern Wisconsin, a P-38 on a pedestal in a little town named Poplar, Wisconsin, near what they call the Richard E. Bong Junior High School. And there's a little, maybe 15 by 15 foot square museum to Richard Bong, who came from that town. Later, 20 years later in the story, all of that was moved to Superior in a major museum in Superior, Wisconsin called the Veterans Museum. And the P-38 on a pedestal in Poplar was moved to the new museum.
Well, thanks so much for your reminiscence on that, Professor Clark. I think many people will be interested in the story.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Good luck to you, sir.